Welcome, everybody, to the Fighting and Finance podcast. I'm so excited to be joined today by my guest, John Nash. For those of you who don't know John is one of the biggest MMA journalists in the space. And I have had the honor of speaking to him throughout the past year a few times. And he's educated me quite a bit on the topic that I want to dissect today. And that's fighter benefits, fighter pay, and all that stuff that we've kind of focused here on the podcast. So, John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. The biggest, you by that, you mean I'm actually one of the taller guys because I'm 6'3". So I'm not, I don't know if I'm biggest. I'm a small fish and I'm I guess a bigger fish in a very small pond, considering I cover something very few people cover. So
you don't sell yourself short. I read all your articles and I absolutely love them. So I know people don't give journalists a lot of credit. I value journalism, good, honest journalism, and I think you're one of the best. So don't sell yourself short, my friend.
Wow, I'm turning a little red here.
So before we kind of rolled on the camera, we kind of talked about some topics that I want to dissect. So for the listeners who are joining, what we're going to be talking about today is a fighters union versus a fighters association, the pros and cons, why one will work, why one likely wouldn't. The UFC Antitrust Lawsuit that's still pending and what ramifications will come about from that. Also talk about the Muhammad Ali Act that will add some bells and whistles and benefits to the UFC. And then we will open it up to kind of just a back and forth at the very end. So with that, John, I'm familiar with unions, labor unions, and not so much associations or trade associations. So first, if you can, talk us through why a fighters union is not in the fighter's best interest or may not work versus an association.
Well, if anybody follows me on Twitter, sees me on other stuff, I'm a big union guy. I'm very pro-labor. I think unions are very important for most workers in America. The problem is fighting is a kind of a very unique sport. And there's many reasons why I don't think a union really works in MMA. The first off is fighters are classified right now as independent contractors, just like boxers are independent contractors. And you look at it, it's very hard. If you look at a boxer, it seems pretty obvious that a boxer is an independent contractor. Where MMA fighters make the argument is that they're not really independent contractors. They say we are employees. Some people make this case is because how the UFC treats them. The UFC has more control over fighters than they do other athletes, other MMA promoters do, definitely other boxing promoters. They dictate you have to wear a uniform. They dictate that you have to be available for testing. In their contracts, they call that they get control of your image rights. Not just for the bout itself, but image rights to sell for video games and stuff. They claim that they have a right in the contracts that you have to promote not just your fight, but you have to promote the brand and the sponsors of the UFC. So there's all these extra things they throw on to make you basically do labor for the UFC that would make some people argue that you're an employee. And so, but the problem with that is if the UFC fighters are employees, the case is we would get benefits, and that would be the positive of being an employee, and we get the right to collectively bargain. The question is, when are UFC fighters employees, right? Are they their employees the night of the fight? Are they employees the week of the promoting the fight week when they have to show up? Or are they employees all the time because they have USADA deals, but the USADA only shows up occasionally. They only have to occasionally once a month go out and promote stuff for the UFC. The problem is unless they're employees for more than 30 hours a week, right? I think it's 130 hours a month, they are not eligible for benefits. And so being employee status wouldn't gain you the benefits that other employees get, the healthcare benefits that everybody wants. On top of that, there's very likely, because healthcare benefits would be very expensive for fighters, the UFC might just pay the fine if they were employees and not cover the benefits. Because you can pay a fine. You can be fined by the IRS, I believe it is, for that under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. If you don't cover the healthcare, they might just opt to do that. But my guess is they would be, if fighters employees, they'd be limited in the amount of hours employees, they wouldn't be eligible. The other thing is, if you're employees, that changes your status. Independent contractors, you control your career. Employees and a boss can dictate where you work, when you work, how you work, who you work with. So NFL players are employees. They are told to show up at practice at this time. They're told to work with these coaches. They're told to run these plays. Does that work in the fight business? Do fighters want to be told, you have to show up at this gym, you have to work with this trainer, you have to do what this trainer says in combat, right? In the fight. NFL, they can tell you how to call plays. Do we want the NFL dictating? I mean, UFC dictating, we want you to fight this style. You're an employee. So that opens a can of worms. Is that for the benefit? It also opens another can of worms. There's a lawsuit in New York. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it involves boxing. And basically it was a decision by the court that boxers cannot be employees. They can't be employees because they are purposefully getting in the ring to damage their opponent and cause injury. Unlike other sports where there's another purpose to the sport. NFL, you're trying to score. You might get hurt, but you're trying to score points. That's the general purpose. In boxing, you're trying to knock out your opponent. And because that intentionally inflicting harm on the opponent means you couldn't be covered by workers' compensation as an employee. And so boxers was the one career that they said you cannot be an employee no matter what. You have to be a contractor to take part in this sport. And so does that apply to MMA and does it apply to other states? I'm thinking that it's very likely that it would. And so just the nature of the sport, that a fighter couldn't be an employee. And then the final point, I know I'm going long on this.
No, this is great.
What makes it hard to be a union is the power of a union is the collective action, just basically to strike. That's the number one power of a union. And there's all these other, legal issues, the powers they get to, look for negotiating. But the number one thing that they can do is the fighters can band together, collectively bargain and strike. Well, fighting is the one profession designed where it's almost impossible to collectively organize, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's first you got to get everybody to sign on to the union, but they're spread all over the world. Every few years, a whole new crop of fighters coming in. So it's a different wave of members of the UFC. So you can't get them to sign the cards to authorize it. And then finally, when you want them to strike, their careers are short. A teacher strike, they're like, well, I'm willing to miss 3 months of work as a teacher, 6 months, because I have a 20-year career to make up what I lost. A fighter's like, my peak is 1 or 2 years.
Yeah.
If we ever sat out for an extended period of time, I'm going to miss the prime of my career. On top of that, UFC, these are not in the NFL. They want to hire the best fight players in the world. They need that because their team wants to win. So we got to get the best players to beat the other teams because that's what drives our team popularities. We're better. In the UFC, yes, they have some of the best fighters, but they control the titles. They pick who's the best the fighters. They pick who gets into the league. There's no litmus test for being a UFC fighter. If they declare you a UFC fighter, you're UFC quality.
Right.
And so if there was a strike, the UFC, they're not like the NFL where they have to have all the teams, all the games playing on every Sunday. So if half the league doesn't show up, they can't hold games. The UFC is like, we just need to hold one event per week. And so out of all of our fighters, we just need 20 fighters to show up. And because there's no barrier to entry for a fighter to be in the UFC, there's no quality control. Whatever fighters we can't get to cross the picket line, we just sign new fighters.
Right.
And we fill up that roster and we'll keep holding events. And we get that contractual money from ESPN. So just holding events, we'll get paid. And people are like, well, it's going to cause a dip in quality. It might for a while, but eventually, how long are fighters going to hold out? They would have to hold out forever,
right,
to get them to the ESPN to finally step in. After a few months, more, just like we saw with the NFL strikes in the 80s, after all, more and more players would start crossing the line. And it'd be much faster with UFC fighters because they don't have the strike funds that the NFL had.
Right.
So, I mean, it's sad to say, but that's all my laying out there is I just do not think for multiple reasons a UFC and a union would work. It's feasible or even actually would be allowed.
Very well put together. And I appreciate that. So that leads to my next question, which is an association. So if we can't do a union for reasons that you just laid out, first of all, 2 parts of this question. What benefits would a trade association, we'll call it the, Fighters Trade Association, would that create? And then how much percentage of the roster would need to join the association for them to be able to do anything?
Well, an association is obviously easier because a union, there's rules in the NLRB or NLRA that dictates how to form a union. You need a certain percentage of the workforce, and it only applies to a certain one site, one employer, right? So you unionize the UFC, you unionize a McDonald's restaurant. You don't unionize a Ford factory. You don't unionize all the car factories. An association applies to a trade, so it applies to everybody in that profession.
Mhm.
Now, you don't have the power to strike because you're not a union. You can't,
Right.
that'd be collusion. But with an association, they're easy to form because you just need a few people. In fact, we have several associations. The trick is how to get enough fighters, contemporary fighters in the UFC, to give them leverage to do something. So you would need a few fighters, but you don't need the overwhelming solidarity that you have with a union. I would see that if you could get several fighters, I don't know what, but you need, I mean, a lot more than they have now, but let's say a sizable percentage, let's say a quarter of the roster of the UFC,
Mhm.
specifically the bigger name guys. There's a lot of stuff you could do with an association. You could lobby Congress, right?
Mhm.
If you lobbied Congress to get the Ali Act passed. Now, right now, Congress, there's not much force to get Congress to pass it, but if big name fighters are showing up in the halls or showing up and campaigning with politicians, that might get a lot more of them on board to pass the Ali Act. You could pool, because fighters, an association has standing for their fighters, like Nate Diaz's recent contract. He was out for 6.5 years. Well, what if the UFC extended that further? Could he have taken the UFC to court? Probably, but it's risky on his behalf. But an association, because they have standing, they can sue on behalf of everybody, right? So they can step in and take. So one fighter is no longer challenging UFC by themselves and taking all the risk. All the fighters are pulling it, and if they win, they set precedent that helps everybody out. So that's the first few things that would probably be the most beneficial right away.
So the association is that backed by the National Labor Board, or what would what entity or body oversees the association?
It doesn't have the protections of the NLRB, so fighters would be at risk of repercussions by the promoter because they're independent contractors. What it does have, though, it has standing. And so an association, because an association represents a profession, normally outside bodies can't come in and sue on behalf of someone, right? They need standing. But association, because they represent fighters, if an issue affects fighters, they can step in and say, we are taking this lawsuit on behalf of this fighter.
Got it.
And so you have this group organization that can do lawsuits and stuff like that together. They can also pool themselves to, pool their resources for, let's say, image rights. The UFC has some image rights, but they could sell their own. They could individual fighter image rights might not be worth much, but a whole mass of them might be worth something. They could pull themselves, I'm sure you've talked on your show, benefits. They could put themselves together and start finding ways to offer benefits to the other members. So there's plenty to do. I mean, the big one, though, obviously would be if they could get the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act passed, because that would offer the association something much more than just the association itself, because you have the right to private action. That we'll talk about the Ali Act, I'm sure, down the line here, but you have the right to private action in the Ali Act. Again, we said association has standing, so they can sue on behalf of the fighters to basically enforce the Ali Act. And when I talked to a bunch of people, promoters like Lou DiBella and Leon Margolis and Patrick English, the attorney boxing, and I told them, what happens if we expand the Ali Act to MMA? They say, oh, it does some things. They go, what if we have an association? They go, that's the game changer. If you ever have an association of the Ali Act, you have a game changer, because no longer are you dependent on the federal government or the athletic commissions to enforce it. You can do it yourself from now on.
So talk me through that, the Ali Act with the association. So what would that look like? What are the pros? What are the cons?
Well, you got to get the Ali Act passed, but the Ali Act has several provisions that protect fighters, and one of the main provisions is it prevents it has a firewalls between managers and promoters. It also prevents you from compensating sanctioning organizations. So there's a question: does that mean MMA promoters, if the Ali Act was expanded to MMA, does that mean MMA promoters couldn't have their own titles? There's a big question about that. A lot of people think that if you read that, that means MMA promoters couldn't have their own title and have to use an independent body, which that'd be a game changer. It also demands that you reveal your compensation. The money the promoter making has to reveal it to the boxers on the card, especially the guys that are driving the card, the top guys. Well, an association, let's say a fighter wanted to know what the compensation, what kind of money his promoter made, and he thinks the promoter's not revealing it. Well, he might challenge the promoter in court and say, you got under the Ali Act, you have to reveal this to me. But he's like, oh man, I just don't have the money. I don't want to go forward with this. The association then could step and say, you did not reveal this, your compensation. We are going to go to court, sue you, right, on behalf of him, so he doesn't have to put up the initial money. And if we win, in the Ali Act, it says that the promoter, if they lose, they have to cover all the expenses.
Oh, wow.
And so as soon as you win a case, you have a fund to file new lawsuits. You just have to raise the money for the first one, because as soon as you win, you have this fund that keeps growing that you can keep using to go back to keep suing other people that violate the Ali Act. So there's that. There's also course of contracts. You cannot demand someone sign a contract with you for more than a year to get a title fight. So you could use that and to challenge the promoters and say, listen, that was a course of contract that you demanded this fighter signed a 3-year deal just to get a shot at the championship. You can't do that.
Yeah, that's, having these conversations with fighters. I'm not sure why I'm not showing up on screen, but anyways, their contracts are written in such a way that it's just tough, because they'll get that 4-fight contract, and this better than almost anybody. But when they're in that third fight, the UFC will approach them, or Bellator will approach them to renegotiate. And if they want to fight out their contract, they're going to give them the worst possible matchup to incentivize them to re-up that contract, or to just leave the UFC on a bad note. So you're saying that the Ali Act would affect these type of contracts to make it more in the favor of the fighter?
Well, I mean, okay, let's walk through. Let's say the Ali Act. Let's say we pass an MMA expansion of the Ali Act, and let's say we insert in the preamble just a simple sentence. The simple sentence says, one of the purposes of this act is that MMA promoters have been abusing their powers by operating like sanctioning organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now when a court looks at it, they go, well, that's the purpose. So this part about compensation between a promoter and a sanctioning organization, that implies we know the purpose. The purpose is to prevent promoters acting like sanctioning organizations. They can't have their own title. And so one of the things, like you said, Bellator or UFC, you're fighting, and they say you want to fight for the title because the title, being the champion, is what you're there for. Also makes you more famous, bigger, a bigger draw. Well, we are not going to put you on path to a title shot until you sign a 6-8 fight deal. And you're like, well, let me see. If I win the title, I'm at my most valuable, but now I'm locked into a long-term contract.
Yeah.
Well, if we separate the title from the promoter, and that fighter is ranked number 3 in boxing, your ranking is a property right. You own your ranking. The promoter doesn't own it. So if you're like number 3 in the world, and they're like, well, we're not going to offer you the title fight unless you sign with us, you can say, I ain't signing. I'm still number 3. I'll go to another promoter. I'll beat someone. I'll be declared the mandatory. I still get my shot at the title.
Yes.
You can't deny me my shot at the title because I didn't sign with you.
Got it.
And so the promoter, Carlos Newton, had he expressed this perfectly once. He said, in MMA, fighters compete with each other for promoters, but in boxing, promoters compete each other for fighters who compete for titles. And so
I love it.
It's the reverse. It's you in MMA, you are competing with another fighter, because if you do not take the offer lower, as we've seen many times, like, he's asking too much, we're going to go to this guy. He gets the title shot because he's, easier to work with. And at boxing, it's like, no, you have to deal with me because I'm the mandatory.
Got it.
And if you don't let me fight, there's going to be a purse bid, or you're going to be stripped, your guy, because he didn't fight me.
Well, that all sounds good and dandy and amazing, but I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. Remember the Manny Pacquiao Floyd Mayweather fight that kind of took forever to come to fruition? And a lot of big fights in boxing, for whatever reason, they just don't get made, or they get made too late. Is that a risk that you just have to accept if the Ali Act gets passed? And if so, how does that come to fruition? Like, how does a fighter who's mandatory required to fight for a championship can hold out, or how does that process work?
Well, it is a problem in boxing, and it's a problem because it's kind of designed, the sanctioning organizations, they've kind of skirt the Ali Act, and they're still it's not perfect. The industry has not been recreated. It's not enforced the way it should be. With the right of private action is there, and it's got rid of the course of contracts, but there's still a lot of problems in the sport. And so there's a couple things. First of all, on the way it works is right now, I'm declared a mandatory by a sanctioning organization, right? Well, what will happen is the bigger name boxer will come up to me and say, I don't want to fight you. I want to fight this guy. He's going to pay me more. I'm going to give you step aside money. Right. And you're like, okay, I'll take the money. I don't have to fight him, but I'm going to get money not to fight him. Well, that's kind of a win, even though what you really want is the title shot. But let's say you reject and say, no, I want my mandatory title defense. Well, the bigger fighter might say, I don't want to fight you because you're risk and you don't draw. I'm just going to drop the title. Now, you can then fight to get the title, but you might say, it doesn't mean much, because without fighting this guy, I don't get the big payday. So I'm just going to take the step aside money because it's more money, and hopefully eventually I get my title shot.
Got it.
So there's many ways they skirt this stuff. I mean, Pacquiao and Mayweather were so big at the end, they dropped the titles. They didn't even need them. You know, that was not Mayweather didn't need titles to drop. People knew he was the best.
Right.
But there's a couple ways we could fix this. One, there's an amendment that was up several times that would have actually fixed a lot of problems, the Ali Act, called the Professional Boxing Amendment Act. Never got passed. So if you had an association, if you got the Ali Act passed, you could go back and just lobbying in and go, now let's pass that amendment that fix a lot of these problems, that puts in a United States Boxing Commission that supervises all the commissions, that makes sure that the sanctioning organization's rankings are objective, that makes sure that you get, basically they oversee and they sign off on who gets the mandatories and who's ranked. So that way you can't, like, what's this guy out of nowhere came up to be number 3 in the rankings? This doesn't make sense. Then you find out later that they paid a lobbying fee with the rankings. So there's a lot of that stuff would clean up that. Another option is, here's the thing: if we have an association and we get enough people in that association, we can do something really wild. And that's the association could create its own sanctioning organization.
Oh, wow. Okay. Talk me through that.
Well, a sanctioning organization is just a nonprofit, but basically you're going to do what the PGA does, the PGA Tour. You know, the PGA, the golfers have a say in this. They have this tour. And what you're going to do is you're going to say the boxers are going to get together. The association is going to endorse their own sanctioning organization. They're going to basically declare, here's the rules of that sanctioning organization. Let's say we only use the consensus rankings of computer rankings from Fight Matrix computer rankings, and then the top independent rankings. That'll be our established rankings. So now we have objective rankings, and none of the other sanctioning organizations use those rankings, so you're not going to use them. You're going to just use yours. Then you can have rules like, the sanctioning fee goes towards one, running the sanctioning organization, but the other part goes to, let's say, a pension fund. So fighters are not putting in tons of money to these sanctioning organizations being wasted. We're putting the money into the fighters themselves. So maybe a percentage goes to the guys in the main card that are fighting. So in the future, these guys that are, being the champions will have money to draw on, but then another part of it goes to the general fund for other fighters.
Sure.
So, but a 2-3%, sanctioning fee, that's several $100,000 a big fight. So if you had a sanction organization then, and that solves the problem, because if enough top 10 fighters are in this association, they say, we're only going to use this sanctioning organization. Well, that basically means the other titles aren't the real titles anymore, because what makes a title is the fact that the best fighters are the champions.
Right.
And so now you've made this the title, the real title. And so all the people are worried about, boxing has too many titles. Well, you just fixed it. We have just the MMA title. And if we want more than one title, we'd say we'll have one title for the cage and one for the Japanese ring. So we have 2 titles. And so that you have twice as many fighters at the top, so you could get more fighters getting big purses because they're higher ranked, and then they could fight each other for bigger, super fights. But you're basically still limiting yourself to the idea, like, we are only going to have fighters, fans, you don't like too many titles. Okay. The association, we have our own ranking organization. Your fighter is a fighter, you're guaranteed objective rankings. There's no shenanigans. You don't have to buy your way in. You don't have to sign with certain promoters. Wherever you go, you're in these rankings. And if you beat the right guys, you move up. And we'll have maybe a box off. It's an old term for boxing where the top 4 contenders fight to get to be the mandatory. But that way, like, not one promoter could hog all the top fighters, because they did. Like, look at Bellator. UFC right now could say, we're always going to have the mandatories because we have the top fighters. Well, if we have a box off, top 4 guys, not including the champion, well, then Corey Anderson and Nemkov would probably be in it. Antonio McKee and Pitbull might be in it. So you have there'd be opportunities for other promoters to get their fighters in there. So fighters have options. They can go anywhere and potentially get a chance at the title.
Got it. Now, one of the things I've been hearing from fighters as to why they don't want to sign on an association is confidentiality. They're just fearful that the UFC will catch wind of them signing their name on this card, this association card, and they'll shelf them, or they'll just kind of make their career difficult. What do you say to those fighters? How would you kind of, if you were to guide them or advise them, what would you say?
I 100% agree. I mean, I understand. I talked to Nate Corey about this, and he talked about he doesn't expect current fighters to show up in Washington, D.C. with him. He just doesn't, because he knows the fear is too much for him. I think the fighters you want are the retired guys with names, but also the recent retired. Also, the fighters have nothing to lose anymore. There are fighters at the point of their career that kind of, they're like, okay, I'm at the end of their career. I'm not going to get a better deal, or maybe I've left the UFC, whatever. I can show up and sign on to this now, right? Or I don't care. Luke Rockhold, remember, he was at the end of his ropes recently. Perfect example. Like, what did he have to lose at that point?
Nothing. Yeah, that's a great point. That's exactly the person that came to mind.
So some of these older guys, but you could understand until you have in place the ability that you don't have to go to a certain promoter to make money or be big, you could see the fear. But as soon as if you get to the point where you have like the Ali Act and fighters, then it doesn't matter, because it's like, well, what are you going to do? I'll just leave. I'll go somewhere else.
John, in a perfect world, if you, obviously you're on the fighter side, right? You're a major advocate for them.
Until someone starts paying me. I'm waiting for that payday.
As we all are. But until then, what systems and operations would you put in place to get this association up and running? And how long realistically do you think it would take to educate the fighters, get them to join, or even get retired fighters or big names?
Well, I mean, the sad truth is most fighters don't pay attention to this stuff.
Yeah.
It's usually there's fighters. I'm sure you're well aware the fighters are guys starting the business. They're just happy to be there. They keep like putting my nose down. I'm going to get rewarded. The promoter's great. And then they look at their career and they hit that peak and they start seeing the downward arc of their career come. They go, I didn't get anything I thought I'd get. Yep. I didn't get what I thought I deserved. And now it's coming to an end and it's too late to do anything about it.
Yep.
So I guess for me, one thing, I mean, a simple thing that could happen that would help a little bit, but wouldn't address the association, was it'd be nice if like the MMA JA or the media didn't use the UFC or Bellator rankings, because that's a form of control by them. They, you're in our rankings. It'd be nice if they used a consensus rankings that put all the fighters from all promoters in one rankings. And that way, and then just only republished them all the time in their sites instead of using UFC rankings. So if you saw a fighter was number 3 in the UFC and then he went to Bellator or reverse, he didn't drop out of the rankings. You just, he's still there. And I'm intrigued. I want to see this guy come over and fight him and give fighters a little more leverage. Mm-hmm. And it also lay the groundwork for the idea, if you ever do a sanctioning organization, that you have this rankings that fans are used to. But for fighters, it's not going to be simple. I think it's going to be step by step. We're going to need to see the victories. We're going to need the fighters need to see victories and become aware that things can change. We've seen the first steps with the antitrust lawsuit. It got filed. Fighters started talking about the wage share. Why? Because it was revealed by the antitrust lawsuit. That stuff was not known before. As much as, Jake Paul and everybody will say, well, the fighters make 20%. Jake, you didn't find that number out. That number was found in discovery. And so you should give credit to the people that actually did the discovery to get that number out. And that became a big talking point afterwards. We also know how, Joe Silva operated because of that discovery. We have documented proof of some of the actions, how they behaved towards fighters. We also now have contract changes. UFC contracts have changed over the last few years. They're not as bad as they used to be. And we're seeing that with Francis Ngannou, who's now a free agent. He hasn't announced it. I think it's because he actually wants to go back to the UFC. But he was able to fight out his contract. There's other fighters on their way that are able to fight out their contract. They're not being able to frozen, like, there's a maximum sunset provision in that contract that puts an end date on it that didn't exist before. So fighters are now able to leave. So fighters will see that now. If the next step is if fighters like Nate Diaz go somewhere else, or if, let's say, Francis ends up or Paulo Costa leaves the UFC and they start seeing him making more money. Right? A lot more money. They go, wait a minute. Why is he making more? Especially like if a Francis or Nate Diaz goes somewhere else and there's a big, I guess, let's say just a magical situation. Francis does leave the UFC. I think he's going to resign, but let's say he leaves the UFC. A year from now, John Jones's contract's up. same sunset provision, doesn't sign 3 years. He leaves. Those two have a huge fight pay-per-view.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe it's not as big as it'd be in the UFC, but it's still very big.
Mm-hmm.
And it sells, 700,000-800,000 buys instead of a million. Maybe it does well over 1 million in the UFC, but it does very good. And both of them make Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder numbers. Well, for a lot of fighters, it's going to open up your eyes. Wait a minute. This fight didn't do as well outside the UFC, but they made more money here than they ever possibly could in the UFC. And other top fighters, why aren't I seeing that kind of money? And the money's out there. If other people put on the fight, maybe maybe the event doesn't make as much as the UFC, but I will make more money. And that'll start waking fighters up. And then they'll start asking, okay, well, I can't leave the UFC because these contracts, even though they're better, they're still restrictive. Then they might start paying attention, like, what can we do to make it easier for us? And so I think you need some wins, and then you need some awareness that things can even get better. And, we've had some wins. Let's say the antitrust lawsuit win. There's a big settlement, and they even pare the contracts down. That's a big win. Fighters might say, hey, we won something. We want more of that. And so let's do the next step. I hear you guys won this suit. You have another plan. Let's try to get the Ali Act passed. Let's start to do this stuff. So I think that would be the steps. That you need some victories, and then you need some concrete results, and then you need to see that, there's a chance to even make it better, that I can benefit even more.
Got it. I agree with you. I think it has to be systematically done like that. It can't just be an overnight, something happens and an association's created. It has to be those small wins. And in my conversations, what I've gathered is that fighters just are not educated, like you mentioned. They just don't know what else is out there. Finance is my bread and butter. So when I see the numbers that the UFC's put up, based on your article, by the way, which is done beautifully, I see that they've just surpassed $1 billion in revenue. They'll likely do 10, 20, 30% more this year, and their costs are still low. Like, as a business owner, that profit margin of 48%, like, good for the UFC. Like, as a business owner, I am in awe and in envy of how they are able to grow their business, pump money into it, continue to grow it, all while kind of keeping their roster just happy enough to kind of continue to trek along. But I think there needs to be a lot more education to discuss fighter pay, fighter benefits. And then, like you said, those small wins, maybe a Francis versus John Jones in like a random promotion, they can create their own one. They'll see the numbers that are generated. They'll retire, have family or generational wealth, and then say, I was doing this for 1/50th of the price that, the free market really has spoken. And it will take time, but I think inevitably it will happen. Question is when.
I'm not one of those guys who think inevitable, because a lot of people I don't think anything's inevitable, but I do think there's a chance that something will happen, because it's more and more likely that the dominoes start falling. But I am one of those. It's just things have been. You look at decades and decades of downward sloping unions. It's like, well, it's hard to get positive about that.
True. Going back to the association, and I know you have to run, we'll wrap it up on this, but I just want to wrap my head around it, because it's still kind of a foreign idea to me. So let's just say we get 30% of the UFC to sign an association, sign on to an association.
Yeah, it's not like a card or something. You just do a membership. You just sign, okay, I'm going to be a member. I fill out the form. I'm a member now. Maybe there's a due. Maybe it's a small dues fee, because, fighters are not going to put much money into it. I think the MMAFA, I remember their whole plan was they're going to use the collective image rights, kind of like what baseball does, to finance it. So, but
yeah, so financing was where I was going with it. So even if they do charge members, they're not going to have enough money to really lobby Congress or do all the things that an association will allow them to do. So they're going to need a massive windfall. And I'm not sure about image rights or what kind of revenue that could generate for them, but don't you think that the major hurdle to the association is finance? Like, if they get a big donor to provide confidentiality, outline the benefits that are on the horizon, then that will create more incentive for the fighters to join.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's in many ways, even though the national players, the National Basketball Players Association, they're all called associations because they originally were associations, they became unions. Those guys were operating with just, bubble gum and tape and spit too. They had nothing at the beginning because they weren't making a lot. And the fighters in the same boat, So a lot of it's going to ride on the fighters themselves. I think there's some things, if you could, some ways where the problem too is a lot of fighters have handed over their image rights to the UFC. A lot of the rights they still have their own rights to like merchandise, but a lot of the UFC also has those rights. So would an association T-shirt or posters or something sell? Would merchandise with the logo sell to fans? I don't know. If it could, you could generate some money. You could hold your own conventions and stuff, like Fighter Week. You could have your association members show up and sign autographs. Would fans show up for that if it's not branded by the UFC? I don't know, but that's a way to generate money. There's the other thing is, yes, would someone with deep pockets donate? It's possible. I mean, there's no instant benefit for them. Maybe a largest, they like fighters, but there's also the chance too. Let's say you're a guy that wants to get an MMA and you're a promoter, and you're a promoter or manager, and you're like, I want to get in, but the UFC has such control over it. There's just no revenue anywhere else. Well, these guys, if they can pass the Ali Act, it then opens an avenue where I could manage fighters that are now making, instead of 300,000 to $1 million a fight, I can manage guys that are making maybe 5. Maybe once in a while I get a big fighter makes 30, 40 million. Canelo type.
Yeah.
It'd be worthwhile for me to enter into this field as a manager. So maybe it'd be worthwhile to me to help out a little bit to get them to push through these things. They're going to make more competition in the space. So there's a chance maybe you could convince people of that, but I think generally it's going to be up to the fighters. It's going to be just a very low down and dirty operation at first, until if you do get your own sanctioning organization, you have money coming in from the sanctioning organization. You can sell sponsors for those titles. You can sanction fees. The money can be generated there. So eventually there's money, but yeah, the start, it's going to be there's just no money there. I mean, maybe Jake Paul said he'd raise a ton of money. Maybe he's willing to throw it around.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I had that conversation with his manager, and they did speak. This is, I'm not speaking in any sort of confidential conversations. This is all public knowledge, but Nikisa mentioned to me that he and Jake Paul are planning to raise about $50 million for the Fighters Association. What they're going to do or how they're going to do that, or maybe that's all just kind of lip service, we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I think there needs to be money poured into the association, and it needs to be marketed very well. And there's no better marketer than Jake Paul, but there needs to be both sides of the coin, I think, in order for it to be successful. We'll see. I'm excited to see what happens. I'm not too hopeful just yet, but I do, unlike you, think it is inevitable. It may take 15, 20 years. But I think the sport being so incredibly young that they're just, the fighters need to catch up to what they're really putting on, and they are the product. And once they start to realize that they're the product, hopefully things will change.
Yeah. See, I think in some ways, I think it's gotten worse though, because as the UFC has gotten bigger and been around longer, back when this first subject came up, when the tough first took off and the money started pouring in, people were like, oh, fighters aren't getting their fair share. It's like, well, there was Pride before that, and there was all these other promotions. There's King of the, you had Strikeforce at the time, and Elite XC, and even though UFC was still the big dog, it wasn't the only promotion. Fighters could imagine themselves fighting somewhere else. But for the last, I guess, the end of Strikeforce, last 10 years, even though there's been Bellator, UFC's been it. Fighters that have grown up with the idea that Dana White is the guy I want to fight for. I got to be on the contender, so he lets me in the UFC. And I think that's actually kind of hurt, because fighters cannot imagine a different world. A lot of them. The world is the UFC owns the titles. It's their promotion. We fight in their promotion and their league. They view it as a league, even though it's not a league.
Yeah. There's been talks of other promotions being started, one of which I'm privy to. They're trying to create teams that owners would essentially buy teams of fighters and kind of create a new promotion. But again, like you said, the UFC is it's the brand.
Yeah.
And they've built it.
I don't know how a team works in an individual sport too. People like they like the fighters. They don't like they're not there to watch a team. Except the only team is the UFC team.
Yeah. I don't know how it's going to work either. It'll be interesting to see, but I don't know, my friend. It should be the next, I think 1 to 2 years are going to be crucial in this discussion, but because I think Jake Paul and what he being combative to Dana White and all the videos that he's putting out. I think that has created more buzz than all the other stuff. It's just frankly, it's not marketed the way that Jake Paul does.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of times people have ignored it for years when fighters have been doing stuff, that it hasn't got the attention. I mean, it is amazing because we talked about before, Jake Paul says a lot of stuff, but he really hasn't done anything except talk about it.
Yeah.
It generates a lot of excitement. And then you look at the guys doing the antitrust lawsuit, and they've been to Congress. They had a hearing for the Ali Act. They've got a lawsuit filed. They revealed what percentage the fighters make, revealed the finances of the UFC, concrete numbers, revealed how the UFC operates for its negotiations. Got the UFC to change their contracts to make them less draconian, to give fighters they're no longer professional. They've done all this. Not a whisper about those. The Kung Lee, John Fitch, Nate Corey, all those guys. They barely mention them, and yet everybody gets super excited every time Jake Paul makes a diss track and again, it helps. It's actually helpful for Jake Paul to do that, but it is weird. I guess not weird, but it's kind of sad that the people that are actually doing something and trying to move it along are often ridiculed, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I saw John Fitch post on his Twitter under Jake Paul's tweet saying, dude, we've been at this for 10 years. You guys just started and you haven't even reached out to us. Come reach out to us. We'll help you. And radio silence from the Jake Paul camp. I think if Jake Paul's camp connected with MMAFA and the antitrust lawsuit guys, they would have much better chances of going up against the UFC than anybody else. But unfortunately,
I mean, at the very least, you could. I think the game plan they have makes sense to me. You could argue that they're not good at the publicity, they're not good at the marketing, it's not working in the sense of the getting across the public. But I'm just shy. Okay, you don't want to work with them. I would just, instead of coming up with them loopy, weird ideas that don't make sense, I'm just ripping off these guys.
Yeah.
Their idea works, but I'm just gonna put a fresh paint and a nice face on it. And I'll repackage it, but still.
Yeah. Maybe after this podcast, I'll send an email to Nikisa and Rob Macy and connect them and just see what happens.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Wish you luck.
Yeah. Thanks. With that, John, I know that you have to run. I really do appreciate the time. I'd love to have you on again down the line. And once
I love this. This is great. This is you let me just spiel my nonsense. I
love it. Anytime. And if you're ever out here in Denver, we'll do it in the actual studio. But until then, have a great. Appreciate it, my friend. Hopefully I'll see you around. I'm going to be in LA over the next 6 months, about once a month. So we'll do lunch.
Hit me up. Let me know.
Sounds great. All right, my friend. Have a wonderful day, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Okay, talk to you later. Take care.
Bye-bye.